welcome to discussion today about mental health and well-being and emergency services and corrections. And I'd like to start off with what may seem like a weird question since you're here listening or watching this because of your interest in the topic. But the first question I think it's worth paying attention to is why we should care about mental health at all in the first responder communities. I think the easiest way to look at that is to recognize that first responders across the board, no matter what your sort of discipline or your profession, we have significantly elevated rates of mental and behavioral health issues, right? Several. The ones that get mentioned most, the ones I'm going to talk about the most, are things like PTSD, levels of depression and burnout, substance use, particularly alcohol use, and then elevated rates of suicide. And so all of these have pretty significant impact on our lives. And as we're going to discuss later, these risks are, particularly those we know for suicide, are lifelong. So just by virtue of you being involved at some point in your life as a first responder, be it career or volunteer, you may incur a lifelong elevated risk for behavioral health, mental health problems, right? So these don't end when you retire. And so I think you owe it to yourself and to your loved ones, right? Those around you to do something about it and to really prepare for and do what we can do to minimize our risk. And as we start off, I think it's important, who am I to be up here talking to you about mental health and first responders. So my name is Drew Anderson. I've been involved in fire and EMS for not quite 15 years now. I'm an officer in both my volunteer fire department and my volunteer EMS agency, but sort of a newcomer to first responders. I've been 15 years. Some of the people watching this have had a lot more time in first responders than I have. On the other hand, my day job is I'm a psychologist. I'm a psychologist and psychology professor. I'm also a licensed psychologist. I see patients, I do research, and I've been doing that for 25, if you really count the first time I saw a patient, about almost 30 years. And as I got into EMS and fire, what I discovered is a lot of what first responder communities know about mental health is either sort of outdated and in some cases just wrong. So what I like to do is sort of bring what I know from psychology into the world of fire and EMS is where I started, and then now into first responders more broadly. And what we're going to talk about today, just to give you a quick overview of the agenda, is we're going to talk first of all about how bad really are our risks, how bad are mental and behavioral health problems in first responder communities. Some possible solutions then, given that some of them are bad, what can we do about it, right? And things we can do, some really practical strategies. I'm a practical guy. I want to give you something that you can use really. By the end of this presentation, you should have some ideas about what you can do. What to do if someone needs help, because as we'll see, even though we can have some great prevention programs, we are always going to be at elevated risk for these problems. And so it really makes sense to think about how to help others who might need a higher level of care, or ourselves. So let's get started with how bad it is, and also not just how bad it is, but why are we at risk? So I see a lot of people talking about mental and behavioral health problems, but not so much always about why we might be at elevated risk, because that helps us figure out what we might be able to do about it. And I'm going to start with PTSD, partly because it's gotten a lot of press lately. So if you look at social media, if you look at things like some of the industry magazines, there's been a lot of talk around PTSD and post-traumatic stress, or PTS. And just to give you a little bit of background, because that term gets thrown around, to point out a couple things really quickly. One of those is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is one of the few disorders that actually has to have an identifiable, definite cause. And that cause is trauma, right? It's in the name. So to get a diagnosis of PTSD, you have to have witnessed or experienced a traumatic event. And it has to be a pretty significant traumatic event. It can't be something relatively minor. And you also have to have negative symptoms, some things we're about to talk about, for more than a month. This is really important. We do not give a diagnosis of PTSD in anyone who's experiencing negative events after a trauma within that first month. Why? Because these negative events negative events are really common. So many, if not most people, immediately following a traumatic event will have some of the symptoms I'm about to talk about. And in most people, though, they go away within that first month or so. They start to kind of go back to where they were before. And just really quickly, some of those symptoms are what we call intrusive symptoms. Can't get the ideas out of your head, can't stop thinking about it, even flashbacks, the idea of kind of re-experiencing or feeling like you're back there is something. Avoidance symptoms, so we'll see people who won't I won't go by the intersection where that car accident was, or I won't drive by the house where there was a fatal fire, something like that. Mood and cognitive symptoms, a lot of depression associated with PTSD, irritability, things like that, and feelings of worthlessness and guilt. And also arousal symptoms, feeling keyed up, like your fight or flight system is going kind of haywire. Those are all the symptoms of PTSD. Again, really common immediately following a traumatic event, but in most people they kind of naturally resolve within that first month or so. For us in first responders, the common ones that we most likely are going to see are maybe risk of your own death or injury, right? So we do dangerous things, many of us in first responders. So getting injured, getting hurt on the job, seeing other people's injuries, really, really common. And then also there's something I just want to touch on called moral injury. It is similar to PTSD. It's starting to become a topic of interest. It really came out of the military, and where PTSD is really a disorder kind of based in fear. I was afraid I was going to die, or I saw something really horrific. Moral injury is about seeing something or being a part of something that caused you to feel there's something wrong about it. So I saw something happen, it was so bad, it was really wrong, people shouldn't do that. I failed to act and avoid a negative event. And that's about guilt and shame a lot, if it's about yourself, or anger if it's about somebody else. So in first responders, a good example might be during COVID, a lot of first responders felt like they were going out and risking their lives being exposed to COVID, and their agencies were not giving them enough PPE. And there's a sort of this wrongness about it. There's some fear, but also this sort of moral component. And it's a little bit different from PTSD. I mention it only because I'm seeing a lot more discussion about it, and we're probably going to treat it pretty similarly to how we treat PTSD, but there are maybe some differences in how we do that. But it kind of gets under that PTSD umbrella. So how prevalent is this? So I'm always interested in this slide. So if you look at surveys, most first responders, over 90% report that they've been exposed to traumatic incidents. Now, I'm not sure why that number is not 100%, frankly, because if you've been in this game for any period of time, you're going to be exposed to traumatic events. In some ways, it's what emergency services and first responders, that's what we do, right? We are exposed to traumatic incidents. Numbers vary across professions or disciplines, industries, and it's different studies. But some of those numbers, as much as in some of these big national surveys, 33% of first responders showing significant symptoms of PTSD. If I had to pick a number, it's about 20% if you kind of look across studies. So that, if you think about that, that's 1 in 5 of us at some point in our careers will volunteer, career, doesn't matter, will develop significant symptoms of PTSD, right? There was just a recent survey that came out in the past couple of weeks looking at New York first responders specifically, and those numbers are relatively high. So this is across first responders. About 29% of that survey said that they had significant symptoms of PTSD. So we're in line, if that, maybe even a little bit higher here in New York. And just so we know, these rates, depending again on the exact numbers, are somewhere between 3 and 4 times the rate of the general population. So we really do experience PTSD at a pretty significantly higher rate than most Americans will. So those are the rates of PTSD. Let's talk a little bit about why we're at risk for PTSD. A survey came out a few years ago that suggests that the average American will experience 3 real major traumas in their life, at some point or another. And so we know that most people really do experience trauma, but we also know that most people don't develop PTSD. As I was saying earlier, those symptoms in most people are really common, and then they start to decrease sort of naturally over particularly that first month. So why does that not happen as often to people who are first responders? Well, if you think about it, PTSD is related to non-recovery. Like the natural course for people is to have an experience and then recover from it, but that takes time. So if you're sort of an average citizen, you have you see a really bad car accident, let's say, and then you have time to kind of think through it, process it, and then 10 years later you have another one, and then maybe another 7 years later than that you have another one. I've given a version of this talk, and I had someone tell me, like, hey, 3 traumatic experiences in life. I've had 3 traumatic experiences in a 12-hour shift. Right? So we don't have time. We keep getting hit over and over again as first responders with these sort of events. The analogy I like to use is it's like you break your leg and you're in a cast for 6 or 8 weeks and you take it off and you're done. In first responders, it's like we're running on a broken leg. We don't give ourselves time to heal and to process before we get hit again. So that's one of the reasons we might be at higher risk in emergency services first responders. Burnout, one way I think it's helpful to think about burnout is sort of a work-related depression. It's different enough that we don't call it depression, but there's a lot of overlap between burnout and depression. So often people will feel really emotionally exhausted, right? So when you think about that kind of term being burned out, people get they can't care as much anymore. The term compassion fatigue, people will talk about, where you just can't feel good about other people or bring enough empathy to the job, and because of that, you start to feel really cynical and withdrawn. And you get this sort of downward spiral of feeling bad about your job and bad about the people you're taking care of or helping. And that leads to this sort of kind of downward spiral that ends up in something that we sort of call burnout. But it looks and overlaps a lot with this idea of depression. Really common among emergency service providers. Again, that survey that just came out a couple of weeks ago that looked at emergency service in New York. So they found that about 75% of the people in communications or dispatch reported high levels of burnout. So the majority. And for every other first responders group, it came up to over 50%. So again, really, really common in first responder communities. So just like with PTSD, it's important to know why we're at risk for burnout. And there's a lot of systemic things that happen here that we don't have a ton of control over. Low pay is a factor. The one that really hits for most of us is the sort of long hours, sleep deprivation, shift work. Sleep deprivation, fatigue can play a big role in starting to feel burned out. And so that's something that's really, really common in first responders. Lack of autonomy for those, especially for career folks who feel like that they're getting ready to go to the kid's birthday party the next day, but they get mandated and have to do overtime. And so it's the sense that you're not in control of your own life around your work schedule and your work duties can be part of it. And then also just PTSD and moral injury. So we talked about PTSD, we talked about moral injury. Those also can overlap with and feed into, I feel bad about myself, I'm feeling bad about my job. Most of the studies on substance use, essentially all the studies on substance use, have been done on alcohol. Some really focus on alcohol as a substance. Even in states, let's say, where marijuana has been legal for a while, there's not a lot of work on it. So we're really going to focus on alcohol. And the key thing to think about here, there's a lot of terms: alcoholic, alcohol dependent, alcohol abuse, problematic substance use, whatever. The key that we're really looking at is when substance use, in this case alcohol use, gets to a level that it starts to interfere with other life domains. It's affecting your relationships with your family, with your kids, with your significant other, on the job. And that's really the level of substance use that we're kind of talking about here. So those numbers, again, different studies, different disciplines or first responder roles. You see slightly different numbers, but most studies have shown that we do have some level, anywhere from 2 to 4 times the risk of the general population. And again, in that study that just came out a few weeks ago, about 10% of that sample said that they had, or reported they had levels of substance use that would be really considered problematic. So again, not as high as, let's say, our PTSD numbers, but still something we want to pay attention to. So why are we at risk? Well, first of all, alcohol is a coping strategy. We see this in people, it's pretty common people to say, had a rough shift, I'm gonna go have a drink, kind of unwind, calm down, get to sleep, things like that. And also it's, especially in some first responder communities, it's part of the culture, right? Having a drink at the end of shift, heavy alcohol use is really condoned. Right? So it's not as if first responder work makes you more vulnerable, but if a person is more vulnerable to substance use, this is, in some cases, is a kind of environment where it's more likely to find itself playing out. And then I want to talk about suicide, spend a little more time on suicide because it is the more, obviously the most serious of our outcomes. There's been a lot of research recently on suicide and first responders, and what we find is that different numbers, different surveys, but those risks might be as high for first responders, might be as high as 10 times the general population. And so that's a really significant risk. And in New York, again, that survey that just came out, about 16% of that group reported significant suicidal ideation or thoughts at the very least. And that is about 4 times the rate of other New Yorkers. So we in New York are at higher risk as well. I want to put this into context. So suicide is somewhere between the 10th and 11th leading cause of death. It's been in the top 10. COVID kind of knocked it out for a couple of years. I think it's probably likely to end up, unfortunately, back in the top 10. And suicide is really one of the leading causes of death that has not been on the decrease. If anything, over the last decades, it's been on the increase. To put this into context, suicide is already a significant problem in the United States broadly. And we are, as first responders, significantly more at risk than that. So this is both problematic from kind of an absolute sense, right? It's the 10th leading cause of death across the board. And for us, it's even relatively worse because we're at a much higher relative risk than the general population. So this is really a significant problem. And one of the things that we see is everywhere we look in first responder communities, rates of suicide are higher than other line of duty deaths, right? You could argue, and some people are starting to make the case, that suicide in some cases should be considered a line of duty death, and I think there's something to that. What I'm talking about here is suicide has higher rates of death than car accidents, being trapped in a fire for firefighters, something like that. Why is it that we're at such a significantly higher risk for suicide? And I'm going to use, to talk about this, one particular pretty influential model of suicide, psychologist Thomas Joyner, and it's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And the reason I like this is, one, it's been studied pretty widely, and number two, it's actually been studied in first responders. So he's done some work on fire, police, and EMS in particular, and the theory seems to hold. So that's why I like to kind of use it for this discussion. So in this theory, there's kind of two components to suicidality. One is the person has to want to die. Maybe seem obvious, but what he calls the desire for death. And then a person also has to have that capability or the capacity to actually carry out the act of ending one's own life. And you need both of these things. As a psychologist in my clinical practice, I see people and have had patients who've had some level of suicidality pretty chronically for years and sometimes for decades, but they've never acted on that because they lack the capacity. They have desire, but not the capacity. On the other hand, as we'll see, there are people out there that might theoretically at least have the capacity, the capability of ending their own life, but have no desire to do so. Their life is going well. There's no drive to do that. So it's that overlap between both the desire and the capacity that really puts us at increased risk. So how does that show up in first responders? Well, as a little bit of background, there seems to be a natural, some people have actually argued a biologically driven, like inborn drive for life, right? Sort of reluctance to end one's life. And what happens is over time, that natural reluctance gets sort of worn away. And the mechanism is repeated exposure to pain, suffering, and death. Right? That wears away this natural reluctance. You just get used to seeing death, to thinking about it, to being around it, to being around pain and suffering, and it seems like it kind of loses its kind of fear, the sort of fear that's associated with it. And this is us, right? So this is the really where we think the first responder communities might be at higher risk. Pain, suffering, and death is our sort of bread and butter, right? It's what we see every day or experience or around all the time. This is really the mechanism that we think causes us to be at higher risk, right? And this is not just, by the way, EMS and fire and police and first responders. This is any job or lifestyle that has high levels of pain, suffering, death. So, emergency room physicians have higher rates of suicide than family practice docs, right? Emergency room nurses, higher rates of suicide than family practice nurses. Why? Because although my own, primary care doc sees people who are in pain and suffering, it's not quite the same thing as being in an emergency room, seeing it much more acutely. So this kind of tracks across any place where a person's life or lifestyle involves a lot of that. And so that's how we get set up for this. And the other thing that's important is that once this person has a capacity, once you develop, that natural reluctance is worn away, it's, as far as we can tell, it's always there. So it's kind of a one-way street. One of the things we know is that because of that, being a first responder can lead to a lifetime increased risk for suicide. When we think about suicide, often people think about stressful life circumstances. If it was just about the stressful life circumstances, when people retired, we would see those rates drop off, right? Because they're no longer on the job. And in some cases, we see the opposite. We see higher rates of suicide. So it isn't about the call. The calls, as we'll talk about, set us up for potential suicidality. But and this is one of those things that's just not talked about. So I've been through, at the time it was called Firefighter 1, and I went through my EMS training, I became an EMT, and in neither of those did anybody say, hey, by virtue of the fact of doing this, in my case, just as a volunteer, you will incur a lifelong increased risk for suicide. So I think it's something we really need to be talking about in our, starting in our training academies. So that's the capacity. Now let's talk about the drive for death or suicide. Kind of conceptually, one way to think about that drive for suicide or drive is it's an escape from pain. That could be physical pain. In the case of, let's say, somebody who does have chronic pain, it could be emotional pain, shame, guilt, some sort of crisis, right? Where the person is in sort of some level of intolerable pain and they want it to go away, and nothing else is working. And so their thoughts turn to, well, this is one way I can end that pain. So that's sort of how we see that kind of drive for suicidality. And so I think, first responders, we focused a ton on bad calls, and we've developed crisis teams and things like that. And not that there's anything wrong with the crisis team, but if you look, the bad calls are not usually what really causes sort of the suicidality. It's that the bad calls set us up for suicidality, right? The bad calls are about the capacity, right? The capability. So again, we see bad call after bad call after bad call. We develop the capacity. And then if you look at people who have had suicide attempts who live, they'll talk about the driver that caused the desire was, I'm going through divorce. I might, I can't make ends meet. I might be going bankrupt. Normal life stresses, this stuff happens to us as humans. So what you've got is we're all humans. We have lives off the job, our lives off the job, and on the job that can cause stress and that level of pain. But we're given our backgrounds in first responder work, we already have that capacity built in. So that's when those two things start to overlap. So there's other life stressors. That's the desire, right? I'm getting divorced, and my soon-to-be ex-spouse says I'm never going to see my kid again. I may lose my house because I lost my job. Those drive that desire. It's that background, repeated bad calls that cause that capacity. So all this is sort of building. We're talking about suicide. It's kind of this bottom line, and talking about PTSD. I think we need to start thinking about mental and behavioral health issues differently. Right? We need to start thinking about them as an occupational hazard. This is no different than wrestling with a subject and tearing a rotator cuff as you're trying to handcuff somebody. These are going to be with us. Given the nature of first responder work, we are never going to make these things go away. And I think one of the things we have to do is, as first responder communities, we really need to open up our eyes and say we can't pretend this stuff isn't happening. We definitely can't pretend like there's something we can do to make this drop to zero, right? We're always going to have to deal with them. Every agency, every individual as a first responder is going to have to think about this stuff. If I stopped there, that would not be great. So this first part of the talk is really about building the understanding of that risk. I really want to get more optimistic from now and say, okay, what can we do about this, right? Because there really are some good solutions. As I said, we're never going to be able to drop that risk to zero, but we can do a much better job of decreasing our own personal risk and decreasing the risk in our agencies and sort of maximizing our resilience and maximizing our ability to recover. Right? So that's where we really want to focus. As we get into talking about potential solutions, I just want to understand that, or sort of point out that a lot of these issues are really structural. They're built in to agencies and disciplines, and I don't want to blame the provider here. Say it's your fault for being at risk for PTSD or suicide or whatever it may be. Things like low pay, shift work, somebody's got to answer a call at 3 a.m. And so that's sort of built into us. There's nothing I can do about that, and I think that we're trying, hopefully, as first responders and our agencies and kind of our industry or our disciplines are trying to fix some of these things. But in the meantime, somebody's got to be at work tonight, at 3 a.m. And so I really want to give you strategies that will work today while we're working on kind of fixing emergency services to help you feel better and reduce your risk right now. So these are going to be really individual solutions, right? What can you do? And also really practical. I'm sort of a bang for the buck guy, and I want to give you the two things that are I think the most helpful, that have the biggest impact on improving your mental behavioral health and reducing your risk. First one is I'm going to focus on sleep and fatigue. Why sleep and fatigue? Well, first of all, it's really, really common. That survey that just came out a couple weeks ago, 80% of the first responders in that survey reported some degree of sleep or fatigue difficulties. So it's incredibly common. It is the majority of us, right? And other surveys have shown pretty much the same thing. The other thing is that it's absolutely devastating across the board. It's really hard to overstate how bad sleep deprivation and fatigue can be for us. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of outcome. So let's talk psychological risks first. So just at a broad level, sleep and fatigue is associated with depression and burnout. Right? It is part of that process, feeling fatigued all the time, don't have any energy. That is really part of the nature of depression and burnout. But what about specifically suicide? Some of the stuff we've kind of talked about just a couple minutes ago. There's been some studies that show that sleep problems and fatigue predict the development of psychiatric problems, depression, PTSD, things like that, following a traumatic experience. And what they do is they don't put people through a traumatic experience. That wouldn't be ethical. But what we do is they'll take people who've been through a traumatic experience, a natural disaster, something like that, and say, hey, in the few weeks before that experience, how was your sleep? And what we find is that people who say that I was fatigued, sleepy, my sleep was not great before that traumatic event are more likely to develop PTSD after the event than people who reported they were well rested going into that traumatic event. This, by the way, might be one of the reasons that we're also at elevated risk as first responders, because if 80% of us are fatigued, and we're also, as part of our job, we're routinely being exposed to traumatic events. This kind of gives us a double risk right there. Again, might be part of that, another part of that picture of why we're at higher rates. We have higher rates of PTSD. Fatigue is directly associated with increased suicidal ideation. Some of these studies have been done in people who are depressed, let's say, and every day they do a record of how well they slept the night before, what their fatigue is like, and their rates of thoughts about suicide. We find that the same people, on days that they're more tired, more fatigued, didn't sleep well, have higher rates of suicidal thoughts, right? And those days where they sleep well, they have lower rates of suicidal thoughts. So it's really even like sort of a direct connection between feeling tired, feeling like you didn't get enough sleep, and having those suicidal thoughts happen. I also wanted to kind of broaden this and talk a little bit about physical risks. Not only does fatigue affect our psychological status and our psychological health, it affects our physical health. So if you look at fatigue, in a study of EMS providers, 3.5 times the rate of what they call the safety compromising behavior. That could be your own safety or the safety of the patients, right? We put people at risk when we're tired. Also doubles your chances of injury. Again, a different study, but also a study of EMS providers. Why? Well, because you're tired, right? You take shortcuts, you don't think things through, you forget things, and it just ups our risk of getting hurt and hurting other people. It also negatively affects other health-related behaviors. So one of the interesting things about fatigue is every other health behavior you could engage in, sleep deprivation and fatigue make it worse. So for people who drink, they drink more when they're tired. People who smoke more when they're tired. People exercise less when they're tired. Why? Because I don't want to go lift weights or go running today. I'm fatigued. And also, we tend to make poorer food choices, right? I'm tired. I don't want to cook. I'll just go grab some fast food. So we get a double hit with fatigue. It affects us kind of directly, but it also affects us indirectly through affecting negatively all our other kind of common health behaviors. Right? And it's also just associated with disease, right? Directly. So fatigue, sleep deprivation directly suppresses the immune system. This is why people, many of you experience, studying for finals in high school or college, and you get sick. Why? Because you're just not sleeping enough, right? So sleep deprivation directly, physiologically, reduces our immune system functioning. So that's some of the physical stuff. Another interesting thing is the notion that people who are sleep deprived are cognitively impaired. So there was a study that came out. They took people and brought them into a lab and sleep deprived them for, I believe it was 36 hours. And each hour or two, they would test their cognitive function, their reaction time, and things like that, and see how that got impaired with sleep deprivation. Then sent them home, let them get well rested, brought them back, and then got them drunk, basically, and fed them alcohol and measured doses and did the same tests. And what they found is a person who's been awake about 17 hours has the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.05, right? So impaired in, I believe, all 50 states. If you've been awake for 24 hours with no sleep, your level of impairment is roughly equivalent to a 0.1 BAC, right? That is legally drunk in all 50 states, right? So most of you, I'm assuming all of you, have policies at your agencies about not drinking on the job or not drinking X number of hours before your shift. But many of us are walking around, because of sleep deprivation, functioning at the same level of a person who's drunk. I don't have slides for this, but there's been a bunch of work done by the transportation industry, and they find very similar things. Even relatively minor disruptions in one's normal level of sleep can have an impact on increased risk for motor vehicle accidents. So all that stuff is really bad. Sleep deprivation, hopefully, I've shown, is bad emotionally, it's bad for our mental health, it's bad physically for us at several different levels. When people see this, like, well, we should just sleep more, right? And so that's often the big public health recommendation. Well, everybody should get, regular sleep, 7 to 8 hours every night. The problem is we just can't do that, right? First responders makes it really difficult. Some people have argued it's actually impossible, particularly while we're working, to get adequate sleep, right? So that we have this sort of weird tension between, I know I should sleep more. It's really bad for me if I'm fatigued and sleep deprived, but I'm working a job or I'm volunteering at a job where I am, by the nature of the job, unable to do that. So that tension, how we resolve that, how we figure out how to manage that, is really going to have a really important impact on your physical health, your mental health, and again, maybe even your career. Because let's say you're really tired and you end up with some career-ending injury, that could, again, derail your entire kind of plan for the rest of your life. Right? So I want to talk about how to do that. Right? And so I'm going to break some of the options into what to do before shift, what to do during your shift, and what to do after a shift. Before a shift, a couple of things I want to think about is, first of all, assess your sleepiness. As you're getting ready to go to work or to go on your shift, whatever kind of language you want to use, it's important to know your own sleepiness level. If you're coming off of, hey, I was on vacation, I'm just coming back, or I was up all night with my kid who was sick, it's important to know that, because you should be able to tell yourself and to tell others, hey, I may be off my game a little bit today because I'm already coming to a fatigue-inducing job fatigued, right? And so also know if you're pretty well rested, think, okay, I might be okay starting the shift. One thing you might want to consider is what we call pre-shift napping. This has been looked at in the medical world, particularly among shift working nurses. And they found that if a person spends the day or so before, maybe even a little bit before their shift, making sure they're maximizing their sleep, they're kind of preloading their sleep, if you will, including getting a little nap right before you go to work, can kind of top off the sleep tank, if you will, and let you be able to go into that sleep depriving and fatigue inducing next 12, 24, 36 hours, 48 hours, you kind of get yourself in the best shape possible before you do that. And then we're going to talk about sleep hygiene. So I'm going to spend some time. Sleep hygiene is just a label for a series of practices that maximize the likelihood you're going to get good sleep, and that when you go to bed, you can go to sleep. I will point out that if you can Google and there's entire books on sleep hygiene. Some of the normal recommendations for sleep hygiene don't work for us. Right? So one of the things you'll see commonly people will say is go to bed at the same time every night and wake up at the same time every day, even on weekends, right? So you can regulate your sleep and your body gets attuned to that certain level of sleep, and it gets sleepy at the same time every night because you're used to going to bed at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. or whatever. We can't do that, right? The nature of shift work means there's some days you're going to be up at night and some days you're going to not be up at night. So they'll actually often say don't nap, because if you nap, it screws up that normal sleeping time. Well, for first responders, napping may be, on your off days, may be an essential part of your recovery. So I say that because if you decide to look up work on sleep hygiene, you might find stuff that contradicts what might be helpful for you as a first responder. So let's kind of talk about what sleep hygiene looks like. I'm going to give you an ideal routine. I'm going to point out right now, this is ideal. As I go through this, some of you might be thinking there's no way I can do that, but the closer you can get to this kind of routine, the better it seems to be for being able to go to sleep when you go to bed, right? And to have deep and restful sleep. I'm going to talk about what's called the 10-3-2-1 rule. And these are just sort of simple guidelines about when to start to practice sleep-related behaviors. So 10 hours out from sleep, you should decrease or eliminate your use of caffeine. Already, some people are like, there's no way that can happen because I'm fatigued. The idea here is we'll talk that caffeine actually has a longer half-life in our bodies than we think. And so it may not be enough to keep you feeling really alert, but you may still be having the effect so that when you try to go to bed, you can't, or when you try to go to sleep, when you go to bed, you can't go to sleep because it's still active in your body. So for most of us, that means, if you're planning to go to bed at night at 10 or 11 at night, you try to cut your caffeine, by noon or early afternoon at the latest, right? And that's kind of the ideal. For about 3 hours out, no food or alcohol. I think people understand the food one. When you feel full or bloated, your body's still digesting. It's just harder to go to sleep when you're doing that. The alcohol one, though, a lot of people say they use alcohol as a way to get to sleep. Alcohol can be a sedative, but it also tends to generate really poor sleep. So people find that they're actually, if you drink enough, you're going to go to sleep. By that I mean pass out. But the type of sleep you're getting is not restorative. So what they want kind of food and alcohol to be kind of out of the system by the time you go to bed. And then from about 2 hours on, they say no work. And by that I mean don't do stuff that tends to get your more activated, right? If you're answering emails or doing something related to work, you kind of get into that mindset, and it's hard. It's not relaxing. So what we're saying here is about 2 hours out, you want to stopping doing things that aren't relaxing, start doing things that are promoting that relaxation, kind of call it the off-ramp, right? You're starting to get yourself kind of ready for bed a couple hours out. About an hour out, again, something else that people sort of laugh at sometimes is no screen time. I think most people know that our devices, our televisions can create alertness and make it hard to go to sleep. Even with those blue light blockers on most cell phones now as an option, it doesn't work perfectly. The idea here is that, look, if you want to read before you go to bed, try not to read on your phone. Try not to do social media on your phone. First of all, social media these days tends to just make us more angry and get us worked up. But also that blue light has an effect. So if you're going to read a book. Get the old paper book, and do that instead of using a screen. Again, this is ideal, right? Do I even practice these things all the time? No, right? But the closer you get to this, the more likely when you go to bed, you're going to be able to get to sleep, and the sleep you're going to have is going to be better sleep. Right, a couple of just things about the environment, sleep environment. These are all pretty obvious. Cooler rooms, humans seem to like a slightly cooler room, mid 60s to maybe as high as 70 degrees, but you should feel a little bit cool when you go to bed rather than feeling hot. It should be quiet, the quieter the better, again, probably obvious. The other one is blackout shades or eye shades. There was a study done in the fire service that just putting blackout shades in the sleeping rooms made a huge difference in the quality of sleep. Right? Human beings are actually surprisingly disrupted by even low levels of light. So blackout shades, if you can do it. If you can't do it, you're in an environment where eye shades work. Some people find eye shades to be uncomfortable the first week or two because it feels weird to have something over your eyes when you sleep. But people get pretty used to it pretty quickly, and again, can make an enormous difference in the depth and quality of your sleep when you do sleep. There's also a series of things that are called stimulus control. And the idea is that you want your bed and bedtime to be associated with nothing but sleep, so that your body kind of gets a sense, oh, it's time for bed, it's time to go to sleep, and with repeated exposure to the same stimulus, it starts to signal sleep to you. So bed, if you're going to be a real purist, bed is for sleeping only. The main one that people have trouble with is you see this idea of let's put a television in the bedroom and we'll sit in bed for a couple hours every night watching TV, or I'll grab my computer or I'll grab my phone and I'll sit there and I'll scroll through social media, or I'll watch a television show or a movie while I'm in bed. From a stimulus control point of view, it's a horrible idea. Right? Because now your bed doesn't signal sleep. Your bed signals, maybe it signals watching a really funny movie. Maybe it signals, scrolling on social media and getting angry. Maybe it signals something else. You want your bed to be associated with sleep, ideally, and only sleep. Right? The other one that's often recommended is that if you go to bed and you can't get to sleep, what we don't want is your bed to be associated with not sleeping, right, and tossing and turning. So one of the recommendations is 15, 20 minutes or so. If you can't get to sleep, get out of bed. Don't turn on the lights and go watch TV, but do something kind of calm and relaxing for a little while until that sleepiness starts to kick in and go back to bed. Just so, you don't associate your bed with a fight about getting to sleep or staring at the ceiling for several hours. We're trying to kind of condition your body to start to feel sleepy when it gets into bed. So those are some of your before shift measures, your kind of off the clock measures, if you will. During a shift, there's a couple of things I'm going to talk about, and they're called fatigue countermeasures. Most of us, particularly people working shift work, working overnight shifts, are going to experience some level of fatigue. So what can we do to kind of minimize that level of fatigue? Right? And some of the stuff that's often out there, things like exercising, walking around, doing jumping jacks in the break room or wherever to get your energy level up. If you're driving, open up a window when you're driving, so especially like in wintertime, the cold air hits your face. Listen to loud music. These are not incredibly effective. They either just don't work, or if they do work, they work for like 5, 10, 15 minutes and then they stop working. So they just don't really have an extended effect. If it's freezing outside and you open, and you got icy air in your face, as you're driving, that will definitely wake you up. The problem is it just doesn't last. It gives you a false sense of confidence because that fatigue will kick right back in again, sometimes as soon as 5, but definitely within like 15 minutes for most people. So I'm going to talk about 2 strategies that are pretty universally recommended. One of them is caffeine use. Any group that's ever really studied fatigue and sleep, aviation, trucking, first responders, recommends caffeine as an agent while on a shift to minimize fatigue and maximize alertness. And so normal dose of coffee, somewhere is, some at the low end for like tea is about 75 milligrams. Some of your stronger coffees can have 150, even 200 milligrams, some of our energy drinks. That dose, kind of a normal dose cup of coffee or so, is actually enough to reduce sleep-related deficits. It increases alertness and just makes us feel more awake. It has about a 15 to 30 minute onset, so it doesn't happen when you take that first sip of coffee. It takes a little while for it to metabolize in your system. It's got a half-life, though, of 3 to 7 hours. So like I was saying earlier, you could not, maybe that alertness effect starts to fade, but the effect on your sleep can continue on for several hours, particularly people who are sensitive to caffeine can feel at 7, and I've seen some people say like 10 hours later they can still feel that caffeine. There are a couple downsides to caffeine. The one that most people kind of think of is it disrupts your sleep, right? So you got this sort of tension between, hey, it's 3 a.m., I'm going on this call, I need to be alert, let me hit some, grab a cup of coffee real quick, or take some sort of caffeine tablet. But then an hour later, I want to go to bed because it's 4 in the morning, and I can't because I just took caffeine. So you really kind of have to think about, they like to say the judicious use of caffeine. The other one is that you can get tolerance. I think most of us experience this, right? After a while, you need a little bit more caffeine to get that effect. And finally, it's also diuretic. So you get caffeine, you're trying to go to bed, the caffeine's wearing off, but now you got to get up and go to the bathroom. So that can just be annoying for most people. But a lot of pros to this. It really reliably affects alertness with kind of minimal downside. It's safe and effective. So the next thing I'm going to cover that's pretty universally recommended is naps. I know that across disciplines, some disciplines, probably more like fire and EMS, this is possible given the nature of the job. There are other first responder jobs, communications and dispatch, or corrections, law enforcement, police, where getting a nap may be difficult, if not impossible. So what I'm saying is if allowed. And so I'm going to give you this information because there might be times, and you can use this information off the job as well as on the job. So if you can do it in your agency, they allow it, I would take advantage of it. If they don't, just know that you can still use this information for when you're not in between your shifts. So I'm going to talk about 2 naps in particular. One is a 20-minute nap. The way the sleep cycles work is when you start to go to bed, you start to go to sleep in stage 1 or light sleep. You move into slightly to stage 2, which is a little bit deeper than what's called stage 3 and 4 sleep, slow wave or deep sleep. And then you have REM sleep, which is your dreaming sleep. That cycle is about 90 minutes. So a 20-minute nap for most people is enough to just start to dip into stage 2 sleep. Not so deep that you have trouble waking up, but it's enough to actually give you a sense of alertness, even if you don't feel like you were really all that asleep. Stage 1, in particular, sleep, people often don't even feel like they're really asleep. So it's enough to give you some alertness, but not enough that when you try to wake up, you're groggy. What's called sleep inertia, or some people call it sleep hangover, where you don't know what you're doing. There's something called a coffee nap. Let's combine our 2 resources here. And the idea is if you take caffeine quickly, so you're not sipping a cup of coffee, but you have a shot of espresso or take a cup of coffee and drink it pretty quickly, and then take a 20-minute nap. If you remember, caffeine takes 30 minutes or so to start to metabolize, 15 to 30 minutes. So as you're waking up from a 20-minute nap, the caffeine is kicking in, and you're getting the boost of alertness from the caffeine. So you actually get a better benefit than you would by either napping alone or caffeine alone. So if the possibility, this caffeine nap can be a really good way to get a quick nap in and ensure that you're going to be alert at the end of it. The other one is a 90-minute nap. Some people don't even consider that a nap. That's more of a sleep cycle. And the idea is that after 90 minutes, your body is naturally more in a lighter stage of sleep, so it's easier to wake up. For those of you who've woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning to answer a call and be really groggy, that what they call sleep inertia can be really significant for a period of time afterwards. So nothing wrong with a 30-minute nap, nothing wrong with a 45-minute nap, nothing wrong with an hour-long nap. They've studied all of these. They're still good for you. The problem is that when you try to wake up in the middle of that deep sleep or that REM sleep, you can find yourself really groggy for a while. So 20-minute nap and the 90-minute nap, maximize the benefits, minimize that kind of risk of that sleep inertia. So that's during a shift. After a shift, kind of similar to kind of before a shift. But so let's say you get off a 24-hour shift or a 12-hour overnight shift or whatever it may be, and you're really pretty fatigued. So we're really talking about, first thing, prioritizing that sleep, right? Know that you really need to get back as much as possible onto a good sleep schedule as soon as possible. Many people have heard this advice that you can't catch up on sleep. Turns out you actually can, at least to a certain extent. This is where naps come into play. So even if you can't nap on the job or during a shift, you might be able to do a catch-up nap that next afternoon or some other time to really try to focus on maximizing that sleep. So, and then go back to sleep hygiene, right? All those things we talked about before shift are as much, if maybe not even a little bit more important after that shift to get back to reduce that level of fatigue and to kind of go back to baseline for that next shift. So that's sleep fatigue, and that's how to manage sleep and fatigue kind of before, during, after. The next thing I want to talk about, my second kind of intervention, is focusing on increasing your quality of life from the outside in. I'll talk about why I mean the outside in just a second, but what we're talking about here is something called behavioral activation. And behavioral activation is an intervention that's increasingly being used as a broad kind of mental health protective practice. So why behavioral activation? I'll describe it in a minute, but I want to talk about why I'm a big fan and a big advocate for using behavioral activation. First of all, it's an effective treatment for depression. We're not going to go through the full-blown behavioral activation kind of treatment today, but in a more expanded form, it's actually one of the most effective treatments for depression psychology has ever developed. Right? It works as well as anything we've ever developed and a lot better than some things. It's also been used to treat PTSD. It's been kind of an adjunct treatment and can really help and make PTSD treatments more effective, right? So it can actually help with PTSD. It's also, more recently, a version of behavioral activation has been used as part of a suicide prevention program. They call it Building a Life Worth Living. And building a life worth living is, I think, a great way to think about behavioral activation. That's why it's building a life from the outside in. It's really focusing on building a better environment and a life and a lifestyle that really increases your quality of life, right? And that's what behavioral activation is about. It's hyper-focused on helping you build and maximize your quality of life. Behavioral activation kind of thinks about quality of life a certain way, though. If you look at people who report that their life is going really great and they have high quality of life, they report a couple things. The first one is they report relatively high rates of positive emotion in their life. They do stuff that's fun. They have a lot of joy in their life. They do things that are pleasurable for them, right? So they have good times, right? And that's one of them, a lot of positive emotion in their life. The other is they do stuff that gives them a sense of mastery or importance, meaning. They do things that give them a sense of satisfaction. I always use the example, I tiled my kitchen floor. It wasn't any fun, but I feel pretty good that I did it. Every time I walk on it, I'm like, oh, I did that. I feel good about it. Or just doing things that are important to you. One way to think about quality of life is having, as much as possible, experiences in your life that give you a sense of positive emotion, fun, happiness, joy, and give you a sense of meaning and achievement. Right? And so that's what behavioral activation is about, is how do we build that and maximize that in a person's life. I'm going to focus in this discussion is your time off the job. Right, so you can actually put this into practice during the times when you're on shift or on the job. But I'm going to focus on off-the-job time because that's more under your control. Right? Again, you could be trying to do this while you're working, and you don't control your work hours. You don't control what happens at work. So you don't know what kind of calls you're going to get or how busy you're going to be. But you got hopefully at least a little more control on that, if not a lot more control, when you're at home or at least not working. The other one is even those of us who work pretty busy schedules, still the majority of your life happens when you're not at work. So having something to focus on and maximize your off the work time, just again out of the sheer numbers, is maybe more effective. So I'm going to walk you through the process. This is an incredibly simplified version of this. We could spend hours or weeks even discussing this in a lot more detail, but I want to give you walk you through the basics of this so you at least get a taste, and it's enough that you can actually use this. First of all, we're going to talk about just doing a life review. Right? So if you need to improve your life, it's helpful to know where you are with things to start off with, to kind of get a sort of a baseline. So I want you to do, this is just an example of kind of, for many of us, our kind of major life areas. So we've got family, friendships, romantic relationships. We've got, people, a lot of our days, most of us are either in school or at work or both. What do you do in your free time? So kind of just go through the major areas of your life. We've got health, religion, spirituality for those who are religious, and other stuff. Right? The number of areas isn't important. What's important is you do sort of systematically go through and go, what's important to me in my life? What gives me a sense of joy and happiness and meaning, and take a little bit of time and work through that. So step number one is just deciding what's important to you, right? And that's what and by this I mean what's really important to you. So I would even say you want to prioritize to think about what are the top 2 or 3 things that are important to me in each of my major life areas. Could be with my family, what's important, in my free time, what's important, right? And so you want to think about that is another way to think about it is if I could craft my ideal life, what would that look like? What would I be doing in my day-to-day life, right? Behavioral activation gets its name partly from the idea that focuses on behavior. You got to do stuff. It's about doing things. So if I were to be doing things in my ideal life, what would that look like? How would my day be? And what kind of experiences would I be having? Would I want to have? Right? So that's area number one, is just do a life review and figure out what's important. The next step is identify from that life review specific activities that reflect and express those levels of importance to you. So an example I like to use is, I would like a better communication in my family. That's really important to me, that we stay connected. Well, what does that look like? Does that mean if you've got young kids that you all do family dinner the nights you can? If you live several states away, as I do from my family, maybe that means you have a phone call once a week. How that shows up is going to be different, but getting a sense that I am actually doing things in my life that relate to what's important to me. Because how many of us say stuff is important to us, but then we don't actually do that stuff in our day-to-day lives, right? And there's a disconnect for many of us between what we think is important, what we want to do, and what we actually do. So this is about sort of narrowing that gap and saying, what can I do that will reflect what's important to me, right? A couple rules for activities: they have to be observable and measurable. Behavioral activation, again, is about doing behaviors in your day-to-day life. If you think about it but you don't do it, it doesn't count. So they have to be things that you can actually do in your life. And they also have to be under your control so that you can actually do them, right? So that's kind of our next step. I've identified what's important in my life. I've identified activities that reflect that and reflect my what's important in my life. It's things I can actually do to have those experiences, to feel important, to feel that positive emotion, to feel those kinds of things that relate to quality of life. And then it's really simple. You prioritize, schedule, you do, and you repeat. Take a minute, a couple of minutes, a day or two to think about, okay, which of these right now do I really want to focus on? And put them in your schedule. Professionally, there's probably 3 or 4, for me as a psychologist, 3 or 4 versions of behavioral activation out there floating around in the world. They all have this one step in common. You've got to schedule it. This is where people who don't actually schedule this stuff, they let the other areas of their life take over, and the minutia of day-to-day life kind of get in your way. If you don't put it on I always like to say, if you don't put it on your calendar, schedule an alarm on your phone, whatever your particular strategy is, it doesn't count, right? Because you may have every plan on doing something that's fun, and then you forgot to go to the grocery store, and that takes over. So this has to become a real priority in your life, and you have to actually schedule it in your calendar, schedule it in your phone, whatever it may be. Do the thing, right? You can't just schedule, you have to actually do it, because if it's not a behavior, it doesn't count. And then just repeat as needed. We'll talk about cycling through here in a minute, but every week you spend a little bit of time going, all right, what were the things I did? How's my life going? Oh, that softball league I was in is over now. I got to come up with something else to do for a fun recreation because I don't have that anymore. And so you kind of repeat and always spend a little bit of your time, we'll talk in a minute, going through and making sure that you are maximizing as much as you can these kinds of activities in your life. Right? That's it. That's behavioral activation. It is an incredibly simple, when you think about it, like how obvious is that? Oh, figure out what's important to me, do those things that are related to it, and keep doing those things, right? But the funny thing is most of us don't do it, right? It's an incredibly simple strategy for improving your quality of life. It's incredibly, like I said, powerful. And a slightly more elaborate version, and incredibly effective for treatment for people who are even really seriously depressed, right? So as far as I'm concerned, there's no better bang for the buck strategy than focusing on a behavioral activation type approach to building quality of life. Because it's simple, we can all do it. You could do it 5 minutes after turning off, after this is over, you could start working on this stuff. And so those are my two things, right? We got sleep and fatigue, we've got building quality of life through behavioral activation. If you focused on just these 2 things, right? There's a lot of other things we could talk about. We could again spend hours, days, if not weeks, talking about other strategies that are available. But if you just focus on these 2 things, you could see a really meaningful improvement in your life and in your quality of life, and sometimes within a matter of days, but definitely within a matter of weeks. 2 to 4 weeks of really focusing on this stuff, people can pretty reliably report that they feel better, that their sort of mental health is better, and that they're feeling more in control of their life. So just quickly, I want to talk about how to actually do those things, how to put both these strategies together into your life. The level of a week is probably a good level to work at. So each week, maybe spend a little bit of time, on whatever day, a Saturday, Sunday, maybe a Monday for you, whatever feels like a good time each week. Just spending a couple minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, going through and kind of pre-planning your sleep, first of all, and start to think about how can I maximize my sleep beforehand and afterwards, and what can I do to kind of use any fatigue kind of measures on the job. So that's the sleep part of it, right? All right, I know I'm going to be on, from Monday to Tuesday. That means, Sunday and Wednesday, I really got to focus on pre-planning my sleep and afterwards recovering from that shift. And then on the job, I'm going to use caffeine as needed if I need to, right? And then around that, because I really think we need to prioritize sleep as a number one thing, but around that sleep recovery, you want to focus on those behavioral activation activities, right? And again, really, really important to schedule those things, right? You really have to be active to make behavioral activation work, right? So that whole process of kind of pre-planning your week, kind of thinking about it, probably again takes you 10 minutes at most. If you have a regular shift schedule, that part of it's already kind of taken care of. You just got to focus on those countermeasures in the pre-plan and post-plan. So that's how you can help yourself to minimize your chances. So like I said, if you put behavioral activation and fatigue countermeasures and all this work on sleep and fatigue into place, you can, as an individual, see incredible improvements in physical, emotional, mental health. But I do want to talk very briefly, at least, about what to do if someone else needs help. If you are at an agency or organization, or even outside of that, just in your own personal life, what do you do if someone feels like they're not doing well? Right, I'm going to talk just really kind of briefly about peer support as a strategy. This is not a peer support training. This is but I do want to discuss it because it does seem to be a pretty reliable way for people to help other people manage tough times. Whether or not you're on a peer support team, or you have a peer support team, or you have any of these kinds of things, just one of the things I want everybody to do is go out there and pay attention to changes from the norm, right? Particularly looking for withdrawal. You know, that kind of post 9/11 world, this idea of, if you see something, say something, is really important. So see something, you got to notice, you got to pay attention, know your partners, know people you're on shift with, know what they're like. If you see them, again, particularly being withdrawn, or you see a change in them, they don't laugh as much as they used to, they don't hang out like they used to, that's concerning, right? And so you want to say something. Right? Be comfortable saying, hey, how you doing? If you're in a smaller agency, or you know your partner really well, you might know they're going through something in their personal life. You might have heard something. So you say, you know, how you doing? Sorry to hear about whatever it may be, anything I can do to help. So notice people, notice those changes, particularly withdrawal, changes in personality, and if you do see those things, ask them about them, right? Because just talking to somebody, just saying, hey, you doing okay? If I can do anything, if I can help, let me know. Even if they don't actually come to you for help, the idea that you cared enough to talk to them, the idea that you noticed what's going on in their life and you said something can be really, really helpful. Peer support does not have to be formal. Just sitting around, talking with your partner, talking with people you're on shift with, is the way that human beings have been managing distress since we've been human. Even an informal level of just interacting with other people and asking them how they're doing can be incredibly helpful. If you've got a formal peer support program, that's all the better. That said, everything we've talked about so far, helping yourself, minimizing your risk for some of these negative events, really setting yourself up for success in terms of maximizing your physical health, emotional health, mental health, helping others, in your agency, your partners, through peer support, all of that stuff may not be enough. So I think it's helpful to say, we're always going to be at risk, right? That our own self-care, our peer support won't always work to keep problems from happening. Remember, we are always going to be at some level of elevated risk as first responders. So it's not surprising then that even through our best efforts, our best intentions, we don't always, if you will, fix the problem. And as a psychologist, I just wanted to point out that there are really effective treatments for depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidality. Like, we can do a lot with this. But the person has to be in treatment, or you have to be in treatment for that to work, right? So seeking professional help can be really, really critical to managing some of these issues, right? We seem to be really reluctant as first responders to seek professional help, right? To get that higher level of care. But the sooner we can get someone in treatment, the sooner that stuff can start working, and we can really start to improve that person's life. So getting a person to care can be really, really critical. All right, so when do you want to do that? These are just rough guidelines. I think kind of at the first level, if a person is continuing to have a problem, it's not getting any better. Most problems, again, life problems, will start to resolve, within 4 to 8 weeks or so, or a lot of them will. If they're not, and the person's still it's still not better, either the problem is chronic, right? Significant enough problem, it's not going away on its own, and they need maybe some help trying to solve that problem, because if what they were doing worked, it would have worked. Or again, the person's maybe just using a strategy that's unhelpful for that problem. So, if you keep banging your head against the problem, the person just keeps trying, and they're still feeling bad, and they're still feeling anxious or depressed or whatever, really, really stressed, at some level you say, we got to try another option here, and that might be a higher level of care. At a higher, a more concerning level is if the person's level of functioning is starting to be impaired, right? It's starting to affect them at work. It's starting to affect, you hear it's starting to affect them at home with their significant others, their kids, their friends, right? That's a more concerning level, and I would say that's kind of more of like a yellow flag. Like you really ought to think about getting a higher level of care if it's starting to affect you in your day-to-day life. And obviously the highest level of risk, and this is not really an option, if you feel like that person is a danger to themselves or others, you've got to stop right now and get them the help that they need immediately. Just really quickly also, where to seek help? You might have to talk, and this is, I guess, can be controversial. You might have to talk to a supervisor because this person needs to get some help right now. We got to get someone to cover their shift for them, or I need to take a couple weeks off. I know there's a lot of reluctance in first responders to do that because of the perceived risk to their careers or their jobs. I understand that, but there might be a time when, particularly if a person is at that higher level of risk, that it's something you just got to do. I do know that EAP is an option. Some of you will have EAPs. Historically, I know sometimes people say that EAP has not been sensitive to the issues of first responders, but they often do have crisis lines. They do have connections to helping you find a mental health practitioner. So if you've got one, I would suggest at least looking into using it. But we might be talking about outside mental or behavioral health specialists. One thing we know COVID has helped us understand is that telehealth is just as good for therapy as in-person help. Some people do prefer one or the other, but in terms of the quality of care, you can get absolute quality of care through telehealth. This is helpful because either people are reluctant to go see somebody locally, they don't want to be seen going into a psychologist's office, let's say, or maybe there's nobody in their area. So, as a psychologist, I can see anyone in New York State through telehealth, right? And that's nice to be able to sort of know that you've got a broader range of people to go look for. So what to look for, again, just really quickly, I'm going to talk about a couple things. Depression, really, really common. Any mental health provider that has a license should be able to treat depression, right? There's many forms of therapy that work. I happen to be a cognitive behavior therapist. I'm going to put a shout out for cognitive behavior therapy because I like it and I do it. But there's plenty of therapists that can do this. You find someone you click with. If you don't connect with that person really well, find another one. It's not uncommon for people to have to go to 3 or 4 providers before they find someone that they really click with. So don't go to one therapist or have someone go to one therapist and go, yeah, I didn't like him. This is really not for me. There is somebody out there for you. It just may take a little bit of work to do it. For substance use, I just wanted to point out, for alcohol use, the overarching model in the US is the abstinence AA type model. I would just point out there for people who don't like AA, or don't think they're at a level where they need full abstinence, there are some other models out there, some non-AA models. You might have to look for them a little bit, but I know some people are reluctant to get into a treatment for substance use because they don't like that AA model. And there are enough alternate models out there that shouldn't be a barrier to getting help. In terms of PTSD, I think that if you're going to seek someone for PTSD or moral injury, you need somebody who's had some specialty training. I personally think you should be looking for someone who says they do some version of exposure therapy. That's a term that you should look for. A couple of the brand names of that, there's prolonged exposure therapy, there's something called cognitive processing therapy, there's even a new treatment called written exposure therapy that's showing some promise. Your average garden variety practitioner may not be trained in these methods, so I would ask about them. I would just also mention there's another treatment called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And some people do think of it as a form of exposure therapy, but often EMDR therapists don't call themselves exposure therapists. So if you see that they do EMDR, it's also a treatment that has shown real promise for PTSD. But again, you got to be trained in it. So if you ask a person, do you do some sort of exposure work or EMDR, and they say yes, I think that would be someone to go through for trauma. For suicidality, I mean, obviously that is often a crisis. So the 988, the new national helpline, is available 24/7. So this is something, if your partner says something to you at 3 a.m. and they don't want to go to the hospital in a crisis, because we know first responders won't go to the hospital because we know those people, understand it, that you could at least have a place 24/7 to call anywhere in the country and start that intervention, start at least an assessment for suicidality. Again, EAPs either have a crisis line or have a way to maybe 24/7, get a person to start that assessment. If you have an EAP, I would look in to see whether or not your EAP has that sort of service available. Also, local and county resources. Most counties, I don't know if all counties, maybe all counties, have some sort of crisis team available at the county level. Again, the downside is that as a first responder, you may interact with those people in a professional level, and you may not want to interact with them on a personal level. But there are often crisis teams available in counties and in larger communities and cities that have that can be you could use if you need them 24/7. So finishing up, again, I just wanted to focus on this idea that we really have to own up to the fact that we are never going to eliminate all mental health issues in first responders, right? We're always going to be at increased risk, given the nature of first responder work, right? No way around it. But, like I said, we can do a lot to minimize our own personal risks, to maximize our ability to help ourselves and help others. Right? And that's where we really want to focus, right? Own up to the fact we're going to have to deal with this stuff, and then do our best to put everything we can into place to make sure that we minimize our risk and others in our agencies, from having these problems, right? And like I said, I'm a bang for the buck guy. We should spend, our first thing we should do is focus on those hopefully simple strategies that have the biggest impact. That's why I focused on fatigue management. That's why I focused on behavioral activation and building quality of life, because those two things in and of themselves can have a huge difference. Once we get the big stuff in place, we can work on the little stuff. Right, but focus on the stuff that you can do that really maximizes your ability to manage your mental health and your physical health as much as you can. And then from there, hopefully these practices will start to spread within your agency so that there's an ongoing culture of support, right? Of people doing things for their own mental health, of people doing things to support each other through peer support or other, that really can make a long-term difference. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much. For those who are interested in reaching out, that's at least a reasonable way to find me. There's an email address if you have questions about this, want more details. And to finish up, again, just thank the Office for Mental Health, particularly the CARES Up grant program that has made this available and made this possible.